Thank you. I know folks have places to be, but I do want to take some time if you have any questions to answer them. I'm sure there are several. If you do not have a press packet and you're a member of the media, please see Mr. Greg Brown. He has press packets for folks with copies of the bill, the news release, and some interesting statistics.
You were saying before that you wanted people to sort of start taking this issue seriously. Given the fact that the state of Maine has, by referendum, allowed the medical use of marijuana, why do you say that we are not taking the issue seriously already?
Well, I think policymakers have not necessarily taken the lead on this and taken it seriously. And that's sort of where I'm going with that. The fact that citizens need to collect signatures to address this issue and to get it on the ballot suggests that there has been a breakdown in whether or not policymakers are interested or willing to take a look at the issue. I believe that we need to get ahead of this issue. I believe that with 59% of the people voting a couple years ago in a very, very conservative year, that we need to make sure that we have a thorough public debate and develop comprehensive, strict policy around it so that we do not have it come to the legislature through citizens' initiative.
Diane, I'm confused about a few things. First of all, the dispensaries are just starting to get going.
Yep.
We just did that. And your bill, if I look at it, I'm just looking at it now, but it's talking about dispensary, medical marijuana. I guess I'm confused. If you're talking about legalizing this, letting people grow small amounts for themselves, letting some commercial use, what bearing does that have on the medical marijuana, and won't that be confusing to everyone as it is to me?
Well, actually, it's a good point. And some of the, in the drafting process, things aren't always perfect. The intent of the bill was to leave the medical marijuana structure in place. One of the things that we had a public forum about a couple weeks ago, and it was interesting listening to our AG talk about the complex nature of the laws, and they're very complicated right now, and they're very hard to enforce. One of my constituents actually was pulled over and arrested and had all the medical documentation with them, and they still were forced to go through very difficult procedures. For most people, it wouldn't be difficult, the standard walk a line and bend over and stuff, but he had just had a medical procedure done that made that almost impossible. What I'm trying to do is to leave the medical marijuana as it is, and to have a new conversation centered around non-medical uses. And I think that it's important to let the medical dispensaries get up and running, but we also need to make sure that we are streamlining the laws, making it easier to enforce, and essentially get into the core of the issue, I guess. I don't know what.
So in the non-medical uses, you would be able to have a small amount for yourself. You'd be able to grow it and have, but what if you don't want to grow it? What if I just want to go to the dispensary and get, how do I do that?
Okay, we actually did a caregiver-driven model. We have caregivers under the current system, the medical marijuana system, and they had to go through a process to get a license. There's also the medical dispensary model, which is where you've got sort of your big box stores. Under this legislation, there would be two options. One, you could grow it for yourself, and you can grow and store within 75 square feet, or you can go to a caregiver who would be grandfathered in under this legislation, under this bill, for that license. You could go to that same caregiver, you could still go to Jonathan Levitt, who you already know and trust, and you can get access to your marijuana, and they would be required to obtain a commercial license. And like I said, they'd be grandfathered in under this law, but they would be required to get a commercial license, and they could grow within and store within 2,000 square feet of space. So you would not go to the convenience store to get this. You wouldn't go to Colucci's, for example. You would ultimately have to go to a caregiver or someone who was licensed to grow and distribute the marijuana. Does that explain it a little easier? It's not easy stuff.
It's still confusing to me why you even need the medical marijuana system if you're going to do that.
I left the medical marijuana system in place because it is its own complicated piece of policy. Frankly, I think we should just move toward legalization. But in terms of what it takes to pass legislation, I did not want to undercut at this point the work that had been done. And I think this is a transition step to move us closer to a more streamlined process.
But the question, I guess, is what is the point of having the medical marijuana system if you can just get it from Medicare?
It's a fair question. And again, from a legislative standpoint, I did not want to undermine at this point all the work that had been done and just erase that section of law. I wanted to give folks the opportunity, if they wanted to have their to have a registry or be part of it, and to have a caregiver's card. But essentially, you know, at the time, actually, let me back up. At the time that I wrote the legislation, this actually explains it. At the time I wrote the legislation, the federal government, and this gets to a question that someone was asking earlier, the federal government Eric Holder had put out a memo in 2009 saying that they were going to basically turn a blind eye to medical marijuana. So I started drafting this legislation with that in mind, and it was pretty well drafted before, in the last month and a half or 2 months, Eric Holder released a new memo that basically said it does not matter whether you are a medical dispensary or you are just selling marijuana, the federal government is going to look at you the same. So when I was originally doing the bill, I wanted to make sure that we were able to preserve the medical marijuana component in case, so that we did not eliminate the opportunity for patients to get access to marijuana that they needed, with the understanding that the federal government was going to let that go. That policy has since changed since I've drafted the bill, and regardless of whether we are doing this for medical purposes or for full legalization, the federal government has made it clear that they do not see a distinction between the two. And I think at this point, we should be in a position to streamline all the laws, get them clear, make it easier to enforce. If Maine is going to choose to be in opposition to where the federal government comes down, the least we can do is have our laws clear, clean, and streamlined so that it's easier for law enforcement to enforce.
But they'll still be inconsistent with federal law.
It will. We're currently inconsistent with federal law.
So what do you think your odds of this passing would be? It seems to me that the chances are slim and slimmer.
Slim and slimmer.
Right. Maybe
Two things I'm not.
But what, do you have any hope whatsoever that this would actually pass and be signed by our governor?
People said the same thing about making sure that we could afford to educate our students in Maine, and we were able to set up an educational opportunity tax credit by citizens. Never doubt citizens standing up. Never doubt that. The people are so far ahead of the politicians on this issue, and that's where the disconnect, I think, is going to be. I have Representative Rich Sebra, Fred Wintle, and Aaron Libby, who are very, very far to the right. I have myself and Andy O'Brien and Wayne Mitchell on the Democratic side. This is an issue that transcends partisanship. And I think that if you can have people on the left and people on the right standing up and saying this is a credible issue, we have a chance of getting folks who are in the middle. The real question becomes, are mainstream Mainers going to stand up and start saying what you hear on the streets? One by one, people say, we should just legalize it. We should just stop wasting all these resources. Let's collect the tax revenue off of it. Whether they're going to tell you that at the public hearing or just on the street or in a coffee shop is the real question as to whether or not this moves forward. I'm hoping that if we can have a credible, evidence-based discussion about this, and we can talk about the economics, I think we have a chance.
If the citizens are ahead of the politicians, why not go to the referendum?
We could. I certainly think so. But I'm a lawmaker, and I have a responsibility to my people to make sure that we have a public vetting, that we thoroughly review something. And when you do a citizens initiative, you don't have that opportunity to do that formal public hearing. It's not that I'm opposed to the citizens initiative, quite the contrary. But I think as a lawmaker, my responsibility is not just to pass the buck to the people. If lawmakers ultimately decide that they are willing to go through the vetting process and have a public hearing and come to a consensus around a good bill, and they still want to send it to the people for ratification, I think that's a good place to start. But I don't necessarily think that lawmakers, I think burying our heads in the sand and pretending this issue is going to go away is not a good decision. And considering that Maine is at the top of the list for, as it relates to addiction for painkillers, we need to really think through how we're dealing with addiction policy and how we're allocating our resources.
You seem to me, are you suggesting that this is an addiction issue?
No,
People addicted to marijuana?
quite the contrary.
I mean, I don't see the connection between marijuana and painkillers.
I think, well,
Painkillers.
Because the far right usually makes that connection itself.
well,
I want to hear what she has to say.
yeah, no, it's a good question. The rationale, the only rationale that people have really come up to about keeping marijuana illegal is that it might be addictive or it might be a gateway drug. I don't believe that it's highly addictive. And so by asking that question, we also need to ask whether or not there is a evidence-based reason why we should continue to keep it illegal. So just by asking that question, you have to ask the next one. Does that make sense?
Just in terms of drug policy, you know, when you talk about prescription drugs and addiction and the marijuana thing, it seems like drug policy is just, the nation's drug policy has been screwed up for a long time. People take different parts of that and look at it in different ways. But even on the street, people talk about how addicts shouldn't be jailed, that we need to change the whole focus about that. So if the government's not willing to look at that first, why do you think they'd be willing to look at this piece of it first and go this mile?
I'm not suggesting that the government is willing to look at it, and by the government, I mean the federal government. I'm part of the government by default, and I do want to look at it. The reason that I looked at marijuana specifically is because it's sort of the core baseline product that drug dealers sell. It's what keeps things going. It's what, you know, you don't have, sorry, I can't hear. You have your baseline drug, which is marijuana, and you sell more of that than you sell of the other stuff. But the other stuff is highly addictive, so you're creating an ongoing relationship with that consumer because they have to get their fix. If we can eliminate the core drug, which is marijuana, we're going to dry up such a significant portion of the drug trade that we're going to be able to finally focus on those other drugs. And I think Maine is in a unique position right now because we are known, sadly, for our addiction to painkillers. So let's take a step back and look at the big picture of how we address drug policy. I think that there are people who can become addicted to marijuana, but in terms of its rate of addiction, crack cocaine, prescription painkillers are far, far more addictive. So let's actually address the real issues over here with those drugs and eliminate a good portion of the market of the drug dealing in the black market by bringing marijuana onto the white market or the above the table market. I don't know how
Rich Sievers is definitely a heavyweight in Maine GOP as the leader. I think him supporting your bill is a real game changer. It absolutely can pass. Are you surprised that he came out in support of your bill?
Actually, no. I was at first because he actually approached me about it. But when I thought about it, he's very libertarian. And at his core, he believes that you should be allowed to do what you want to do within your own home. And I think that that's really for him what this comes down to. You know, let's bring in some revenue for the state, but more importantly, he feels, I think, and I don't want to speak for him, but I think that he went from our conversations, his point was that keep your laws out of my house was the type of perspective. And I think, I don't care if you're on the right or on the left, that's an issue that resonates with a lot of people. And I think Maine has a defiantly independent streak and a defiantly libertarian streak. So at first I was a little surprised, but you know, when you think it through, it makes perfect sense that someone like Rich Sebra or Aaron Libby, who's very, very libertarian, or Fred Wintle, again, would be signing their names onto a bill with, you know, a liberal lefty from Andre Hill. But it is a game changer.